Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I always considered myself a faithful wife. Jonathan and I had everything: a cozy home, a peaceful life, mutual understanding. I had no reason to complain about my fate, for I was convinced that I was fortunate to have met someone like him. But one encounter, one weekend, turned everything upside down. I never thought that a simple attraction could make me doubt myself and my feelings so deeply. How did it happen? How did I, so sure of my loyalty, suddenly find myself on the brink of infidelity? When Jonathan and I arrived at his brother Nick's place, I felt a slight unease. I had never met Nick before, but I had heard enough about him to paint a picture in my mind: confident, charismatic, successful. Jonathan often mentioned how his older brother always achieved whatever he set his sights on. And now, finally, the time had come to meet this enigmatic man. Nick's house was located on the outskirts of a small town in Massachusetts. It was an imposing, somewhat ominous mansion surrounded by dense woods. As we approached, I was overcome by a strange feeling, as if I were stepping onto foreign territory. Jonathan noticed my tension and gently squeezed my hand with a light smile. "Are you nervous, Maggie?" he asked, looking at me with his warm brown eyes. "A little," I admitted, though deep down, I didn't understand why. Jonathan was excited about this trip. He had always admired his brother and hoped that I would get along with him. I knew how important my approval was to Jonathan, so I tried to appear calm and confident. But something about this place and the upcoming meeting made my heart race. When the door opened, I immediately realized that all of Jonathan's stories were true. Nick was even more charismatic than I had expected. Tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and a confident smile, he looked like a man who was used to being in control. His dark eyes seemed to pierce right through me, and for a moment, I felt something tighten in my chest. "Maggie, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said in a deep voice that seemed to resonate somewhere inside me. I smiled, trying not to show my dismay. He hugged Jonathan, and I realized they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Nick embraced his brother warmly, and it was so genuine that I couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth towards both of them. However, when his gaze returned to me, I felt vulnerable, as if he saw more than he should. "Come in, make yourselves at home," Nick invited, gesturing for us to enter the house. Inside, the mansion was even more impressive than it appeared from the outside. Spacious rooms, antique furniture, paintings on the walls, everything spoke of the owner's refined taste and wealth. Nick led us to the living room, where a table was already set with appetizers and wine. Jonathan, as usual, started the conversation first, discussing everything from the latest news to vacation plans. I listened to their conversation, but my thoughts wandered. I couldn't help but notice how easily Nick kept up with any discussion, how he looked at me when I spoke, how attentively he listened. His presence was palpable, even when he was silent. After a while, Jonathan stepped away to take a work call, leaving me and Nick alone. I knew it was just an innocent moment, but for some reason, I felt strangely nervous. "Maggie, do you like it here?" Nick asked, and there was genuine interest in his voice. "Yes, it's very beautiful," I replied, trying not to reveal my anxiety. He smiled and, taking a glass of wine, sat down across from me. "I'm glad Jonathan brought you here. He's told me a lot about you, but in person, you're even more impressive than I expected." His words brought a flush of warmth to my cheeks. Nick smiled, and there was a certain mystery in it that made me uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on what exactly troubled me. Perhaps his confidence, or the way he looked at me as if studying my every gesture, every word. "You're too kind," I responded, trying to keep my voice light. We continued talking, and the more he spoke, the more uncomfortable I felt. Not because he was doing anything inappropriate, but rather because I began to realize that I was drawn to him. It was unexpected and entirely out of place, but I couldn't help myself. I tried to convince myself that it was just innocent admiration, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The evening passed in a warm atmosphere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just friendliness had developed between Nick and me. I returned to our room with Jonathan, trying to focus on my husband, on our conversation, but thoughts of Nick wouldn't leave me. I tried to ignore this strange attraction, convincing myself that it was just a coincidence, but something inside told me that this weekend could change everything. As I lay in bed, my head was filled with thoughts and emotions that I couldn't fully understand. Jonathan was already dozing next to me, and I watched him, trying to find answers to my inner questions in his face. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get Nick's image out of my mind. His smile, his gaze, his confidence, all of it swirled in my head, making me feel lost. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should be devoted to Jonathan, but the feelings that had awakened in me wouldn't let me rest. Perhaps this was just the beginning of something more complex and dangerous. I tried to sleep, but thoughts of Nick haunted me, making me wonder what would happen next. At that time, I had no idea how complicated this emotional game would become or what consequences it would bring. But that night, lying in bed next to Jonathan, I allowed myself to admit for the first time that my heart had begun to waver. And perhaps, this was only the beginning. The next morning began quietly. I woke up earlier than Jonathan, and the first rays of sunlight barely filtered through the thick curtains of our room. Outside, the sound of the wind and the singing of birds created an illusion of serenity. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my husband, and went to the bathroom, where I let the cold water wash away the remnants of sleep and tangled thoughts. As usual, Jonathan was absorbed in work. He barely finished breakfast when he received an urgent call and hurried out of the house, promising to return by evening. I was left alone, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The thoughts of Nick that had tormented me yesterday flooded my mind again, and I knew we would soon be spending time together. When I descended to the living room, Nick was already there, holding a cup of coffee. He smiled when he saw me, and that look sent a shiver through my body. I couldn't help but notice how his warm eyes lingered on me, just a little longer than usual. "Good morning, Maggie," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Good morning," I replied, trying not to reveal my unease. "I slept well. And you?" "Excellent, thank you. I'm glad we'll have the chance to get to know each other better today." His words were simple, but I detected a hidden undertone. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the heart doesn't lie. It beat faster, and I could no longer ignore the growing attraction. We spent most of the day together. Nick suggested a walk around the area, and with no reason to refuse, I agreed. We wandered through the woods, talking about everything, from future plans to childhood memories. Nick turned out to be a captivating conversationalist, and I increasingly felt drawn to him. There was something alluring in his words, in his manner of speaking, in the way he looked at me, that made me forget all the rules and moral standards. Every glance from him seemed to pierce right through me. I felt him studying me, and it both frightened and attracted me. At times our eyes met, and in those brief, intense moments, there was more than just friendliness. It seemed that in those looks lay a secret, a promise that shouldn't be spoken aloud. We returned to the house as the sun began to set. Nick suggested we have dinner on the terrace, and I agreed. We sat at the table, enjoying the fresh air and the view of the forest. The atmosphere was cozy, but the tension between us grew with each passing minute. I became increasingly aware of how hard it was to control my feelings. Every movement he made, every word he said, every touch, it all seemed to amplify my attraction. Nick talked about his travels, about how he loved exploring new places and meeting new people. I listened to him, but my thoughts wandered elsewhere. I wondered how he saw me. Did he notice my turmoil? Did he understand how strongly I was drawn to him? And most importantly, did he feel the same? I tried to convince myself that it was just a passing infatuation, a trick of my mind seeking novelty in life. But the longer we spent together, the harder it was to fight these thoughts. When Nick looked at me, I felt the tension growing inside me, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. At some point, when we both fell silent, our eyes met again. It wasn't just a glance, it was something more. In those moments, it felt like we understood each other without words. His eyes conveyed something that neither of us dared to say out loud. I lowered my gaze, trying to hide my feelings, but it was too late. I knew that he had understood everything. I knew that something had arisen between us that could no longer be denied. My heart was pounding so hard that I feared he could hear it. I realized that this was wrong, but I couldn't do anything about it. That evening, as the sun almost completely disappeared behind the horizon, I understood that I was on the edge. My internal struggle had reached its peak, and I no longer knew how to deal with the overwhelming emotions. I knew I should stop, step back, but something kept me near Nick. Maybe it was his charisma, his confidence, or perhaps just the fact that I hadn't felt such emotions in a long time. When we returned to the house, I felt completely lost. Jonathan was still away, and I realized that I had spent the entire day with Nick, enjoying his company far more than I should have. I avoided his gaze, trying not to reveal my true feelings, but I knew it was futile. I went to my room, telling Nick that I was tired and wanted to rest. He nodded, wishing me a good night, and there was something in his voice that I couldn't decipher. I left, but his image stayed with me. I couldn't shake off these thoughts, this feeling that something significant had happened today, that this day had changed me. Lying in bed, I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, that nothing had happened. But the heart doesn't lie. I knew that my attraction to Nick had grown with every minute, and now I was on the verge of something that could change my life forever. But what that would be, I still couldn't say. The evening dragged on slowly, like thick molasses, and I could feel the tension within me growing with every passing moment. Dinner had passed quietly, and Jonathan, as always lost in his thoughts and work, soon retired to our room, saying he felt tired after a long day. I was left alone with Nick in the spacious living room, lit by the soft glow of the fireplace. The room was quiet, with only the crackling of the logs and the barely audible sound of our breathing breaking the silence. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, as if foretelling something significant. I tried to remain calm, even though I knew that a storm was raging inside me. Nick sat across from me, his dark eyes following my every move. There was something unspoken in the air, something that both attracted and frightened me. We started with casual conversation. Nick talked about his work, how he had achieved success in business, about his travels around the world. But with every word, with every glance, I felt our conversation becoming more intimate. There was a note of something deeper in his voice, something that went beyond ordinary talk. "Maggie," he said, and there was a softness in his voice that I hadn't heard before. "Have you ever thought that your life could be different?" The question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. Of course, I had moments of doubt, but I had always tried to avoid such thoughts. I loved Jonathan, or at least I thought I did, but now, sitting across from Nick, I felt something inside me changing. "Sometimes," I quietly admitted, and my words hung in the room's silence like the echo of my own doubts. He didn't look away, and I felt as if his eyes were piercing deep into my soul. I knew that something important was brewing between us, something that would change our lives. I sensed it with every fiber of my being, but I couldn't force myself to leave, to break the thread that bound us. "I think about that too," Nick continued, his voice even softer, almost a whisper. "Sometimes life forces us down paths we didn't choose. But what if we could change everything?" I remained silent, not knowing what to say. The words stuck in my throat, and it felt as though any move I made now could shatter this fragile moment. I could feel his presence so keenly, that it seemed as though his warmth seeped under my skin. Then something happened that I hadn't expected, but something that, it turned out, I was inwardly prepared for. Nick reached out and gently touched my hand. It was a light touch, but it stirred such a storm of emotions within me that I barely managed to restrain myself from pulling away. But I couldn't, or didn't want to, break this contact. This touch felt so natural, so right, that I allowed myself to forget everything for a moment. We looked at each other, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of my own feelings. In that moment, everything became clear. There was more between us than just friendship or affection. It was something deeper, something that could no longer be ignored. "Maggie," he whispered, and I realized that it wasn't just the sound of my name, but a call, one I couldn't ignore. In the next moment, I felt his lips brush against mine. It was a cautious, almost hesitant kiss, as if he was afraid of crossing boundaries. But this caution quickly gave way to passion, and I felt his hand tighten its grip on mine. I couldn't resist this impulse. All my thoughts, doubts, and fears vanished, leaving only one thing: the sensation of his lips on mine. This kiss wasn't just a kiss, it was a revelation, a moment when I realized that my life would never be the same. I felt myself being consumed by this feeling, as I drowned in his embrace, forgetting everything else. But then reality returned. I pulled away, my heart racing, my breath quickened. My mind was in chaos, my emotions a whirlwind, and I didn't know what to do next. Nick looked at me, his eyes full of the same confusion that I felt. But I couldn't continue. I knew that this was the first step on a path that would lead to irreversible consequences. "I need to go," I said quietly, barely recognizing my own voice. Nick nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't want to let me go. Yet he didn't try to stop me. I got up from the couch and headed for the door, feeling his gaze follow me. My heart continued to pound, and my mind frantically searched for an excuse for what had just happened. When I reached our room, where Jonathan was peacefully sleeping, I leaned against the door, covering my face with my hands. I tried to make sense of what had happened, but I couldn't. All I felt was confusion, fear, and desire. A desire that wouldn't let me rest and made me wonder what would come next. I knew that this kiss had changed everything. Now I had to make a choice that would determine my fate and the fate of those I loved. But at that moment, I couldn't give myself an answer. I just stood there, listening to the beating of my heart, realizing that this evening had marked the beginning of something new, something I could no longer resist. Morning came unexpectedly early. The first rays of the sun filtered through the partially drawn curtains, filling the room with a soft golden light. I lay on the edge of the bed, feeling reality slowly return, but with it came the feeling I had desperately tried to escape: guilt. It overwhelmed me completely, leaving no room for anything else. I felt like a stranger in my own body. Beside me, Jonathan slept, his calm breathing barely audible in the silence of the room. I looked at him, trying to find something in his features that could bring me back to reality, to the life we had built together over so many years. But everything seemed distorted, as if that kiss with Nick had displaced all my former feelings, leaving only emptiness. I got up, trying not to wake Jonathan, and quietly left the room. I needed to think, to somehow sort myself out. But thoughts of Nick wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his lips on mine again, reliving that moment which should have stayed in the past, but instead filled my entire consciousness. I avoided Nick all day. When he suggested we go for a walk or have coffee, I declined with some excuse, avoiding eye contact whenever our paths crossed in the house. I knew he understood what was happening, but he made no attempt to approach me. This silent agreement, this distance between us, only intensified my guilt. Every time I passed by him, my emotions flared up anew, despite my desperate attempts to suppress them. I kept telling myself that the kiss was just a moment of weakness, that I should forget about it, But my thoughts, like a persistent swarm of bees, kept returning to that evening. On the dining table lay an unfinished breakfast, and I suddenly realized I hadn't eaten a bite. My appetite had disappeared, along with my sense of peace, and it became hard to breathe as thoughts of what I had done consumed me. The day seemed endless. Time dragged on as if trying to give me a chance to sort out my feelings, but the more I thought, the more entangled I became. I went out into the garden, hoping to find solace in solitude. The fresh air and the scent of flowers, which Jonathan loved so much, should have comforted me, but all I felt was a soul-wrenching dilemma. I knew I had to stay away from Nick, that our closeness could destroy everything that had been built over years of marriage, but deep down, I understood that this was not just a fleeting infatuation. Nick was so close, and this knowledge seemed to magnetically draw me to him. But the stronger this attraction grew, the more I felt like a traitor. I avoided his gaze, afraid that in his eyes I would see my own reflection, the reflection of a woman who, despite all her principles, had proven weaker than the circumstances. My feelings for Jonathan hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer as clear-cut. Every time I tried to focus on what I loved about my husband, my thoughts inevitably returned to Nick. I thought about what might have happened if I hadn't stopped at that moment, if I had allowed myself to go further. It frightened me, but at the same time, it tempted me like forbidden fruit. In the evening, when we all gathered for dinner, I once again felt the tension hanging in the air. Nick sat across from me, and I could feel his gaze on me, but I didn't dare lift my eyes. Jonathan, engrossed in conversation about work, seemed completely detached from what was happening inside me. I looked at him and realized that he suspected nothing. This only heightened my sense of guilt. After dinner, I went out into the garden again, hoping to find at least a drop of peace there. But instead, my thoughts continued to torment me. I knew I had to make a decision, to find the strength within myself to close this chapter before it was too late. But at the same time, I couldn't completely let go of the feelings Nick had awakened in me. When I returned to the house, everyone had already gone to their rooms. I quietly passed by the living room, where just a day ago that fateful kiss had taken place. His eyes, his touch, his words flashed in my memory. I stopped, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions rise within me once again. I didn't know what to do next. My heart was torn between duty and passion, between love and what I felt for Nick. I knew I had to choose a path, but I couldn't yet decide which one. All these thoughts swirled in my head, leaving me no peace. When I lay down in bed next to Jonathan, his calm breathing seemed foreign to me. I knew he was blameless, that my guilt was my own burden, but that didn't ease my suffering. I tried to convince myself that the kiss meant nothing, that I could forget about it. But with each passing minute, this conviction grew more and more fragile. That night was filled with anxious thoughts and doubts. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to find rest. A voice of reason echoed in my head, telling me I had to forget about Nick, but my heart stubbornly pulled me toward him. I knew I had to make a choice, and that choice would determine the rest of my life. When I realized that my feelings for Nick were not fading, but only growing stronger, a new storm erupted within my soul. Every morning, I woke up hoping that this fog would dissipate, but it only grew thicker, enveloping me from all sides. I needed to find a way to deal with it, but the more I tried to run from my emotions, the more they consumed me. A few days had passed since the last time I had been alone with Nick. Jonathan was still deeply absorbed in his work, and when he told me that he needed to go away on business again for a few days, I felt something inside me falter. Deep down, I knew what that meant. I tried to convince myself that I would keep my distance, but something elusive pulled me toward Nick, making me constantly return to the thought of what had happened between us. That evening, after Jonathan left, I remained alone in the living room, nervously flipping through the pages of a book I couldn't read. My thoughts wouldn't leave me in peace, and I knew that soon Nick would appear, and once again I would be faced with a choice. Soon I heard his footsteps. Nick entered the room, and I immediately felt the air become denser, more charged. I looked up and met his gaze. In that moment, everything I had tried to hide and suppress resurfaced. "Maggie," he said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile silence. "You know this is inevitable." I couldn't respond. The words caught in my throat, and I simply nodded, unable to look away. Everything inside me screamed that I should stop, that it wasn't too late to turn back. But his presence, his calm confidence, was stronger than my doubts. "We can't keep doing this," I managed to say, trying to find the strength to break this moment. But Nick stepped closer, and I felt my words lose their power. He reached out, gently touching my cheek, and that touch shattered all my defensive barriers once again. "Why can't we?" he whispered, and I heard a hint of sadness in his voice, but also determination. "We both know this isn't just a passing fancy. We can't deny what we feel." "This is wrong, Nick." I tried to make one last desperate retreat. "I can't betray Jonathan. We can't." But he was already standing close, his gaze holding me captive, and I knew that my words were becoming increasingly unconvincing. Inside me, a battle was raging, but the longer we stood like that, the clearer it became. I could no longer ignore what was happening between us. "Maggie," he said again, and this time there was not only determination in his voice, but also a tenderness that touched me deeply. "If it were that simple, we would have forgotten about it long ago, but you know it's not." I was silent, feeling his words resonate within my heart. Everything I had tried to hide and suppress surfaced, and I realized that I could no longer stop myself. "I'm scared, Nick," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm afraid of what might happen, afraid it will destroy everything." He gently squeezed my hand, and his touch was so comforting that I could barely hold back my tears. "I'm scared too," he replied softly, "but I'm more afraid of missing out on what we could have. We need to figure this out, together." His words were so convincing that I could no longer resist. I knew what was about to happen, and I knew I could no longer stop myself. I let go of all my doubts, all my fears, and allowed myself to be honest with myself. We stepped out onto the terrace, where the cool evening air mingled with the scent of flowers. The night had already descended upon the garden, and only the faint light of the moon illuminated our figures. Nick came closer, and I felt my heart begin to race once more. "Maggie, if you say you don't want this, I'll stop," he whispered, his voice full of understanding. I looked at him, and this time I could no longer pretend. I didn't answer with words, but I took a step toward him, closing the distance between us until our faces were just inches apart. Nick understood me without words. He leaned in and, slowly, with a tenderness I hadn't imagined, kissed me again. This kiss was different from the first. It held more certainty, more desire, and I felt my soul responding to his touch. I returned his kiss, and in that moment, everything around us ceased to matter. Our embrace grew more passionate, and I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me closer. I forgot everything, my doubts, my fears, Jonathan. In that moment, it was just Nick and me and what was happening between us. This kiss became the step that took our relationship to a new level. I knew there was no turning back, that I had now embarked on a path that would inevitably lead to consequences. But in that moment, I couldn't think about the future. All that mattered was what I felt now, in his arms. When the kiss ended, we stood there, breathing heavily, looking into each other's eyes. In his gaze, I saw the reflection of my own feelings, passion, desire, and the realization of what we had done. I knew this wasn't the end, but merely the beginning of what lay ahead. "I can no longer pretend this doesn't exist," I quietly confessed. "Neither can I," he replied, gently stroking my cheek. "We need to figure out what happens next." I nodded, understanding that this evening had become the starting point for something I feared but could no longer deny. Our relationship with Nick had moved to a new level, and I knew that it could no longer be left behind. The next few weeks passed by, as if in a fog. It felt like I was living in two parallel worlds. One was calm and familiar, where I played the role of a devoted wife, while the other was filled with passion and secrecy, a world where only Nick and I existed. Each time Jonathan left on business, I felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety burning inside me. Nick and I found any excuse to spend time together. Initially, these were innocent walks in the garden or shared dinners, but soon our meetings turned into something far more significant and dangerous. "We're risking it again," I said to Nick one evening when we met on the terrace behind the house while Jonathan was away. Twilight had already begun to fall, creating an atmosphere of mystery and intimacy. "I know," he replied, running his hand through my hair. "But I can't stop, Maggie. You've become something I didn't know I needed so badly." Those words, spoken in the quiet of the evening, made my heart tighten. I knew he was telling the truth because I felt the same way. Every time we were together, I forgot about everything else, dissolving in his presence, in his touches and kisses. Our connection grew more passionate. I couldn't get enough of his presence, his closeness. We met in secluded corners of the garden, in the guest room when Jonathan was away, and each time I felt my feelings for Nick deepen. These moments became the breath of life for me, something that made me feel alive again. "We can't go on like this forever," I said one day, as we lay on the rug in the living room, next to the fireplace, enjoying the warmth of the fire and each other's closeness. I watched his profile as he lazily stared at the dancing flames. "You're right," he replied, but his voice was filled with regret. "But I'm not ready to give this up. To give us up." Those words made me think. We really couldn't continue like this indefinitely. Every time Jonathan returned, I felt more and more guilty. The guilt became a heavy burden I carried on my shoulders, hiding it behind a habitual smile and kind words. But inside, I was becoming increasingly aware that this burden would become too heavy if we didn't find a way to change something. "Jonathan doesn't suspect anything," Nick continued, his voice growing more tense. "But I see how hard this is for you, Maggie, and I know I should stop, but I can't." I sighed, feeling his words penetrate deep into my soul. I really did feel torn between two men, each of whom meant something different to me. Jonathan was my husband, the man I had spent years with whom I had built plans for the future. Nick, on the other hand, had become something I hadn't expected, but had turned out to be so important that I couldn't let it go. "I can't either," I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "But what are we going to do next, Nick? How long can we keep this hidden?" He was silent, and that silence was an answer in itself. Neither of us knew what to do next. We were trapped by our own feelings, unable to break free from this chain, but knowing that one day the truth might come out. And then everything we had could collapse in an instant. We continued to meet, seizing every opportunity when Jonathan was away. I felt our connection deepening, my attraction to Nick turning into something more. But along with it, my anxiety grew. I was afraid that one day Jonathan would find out that his brother and his wife had betrayed his trust. I feared that our world, which we had so carefully built, could crumble in a moment. One day, as Nick and I sat in the garden, watching the stars, he suddenly spoke about the future. "Maggie, have you ever thought about leaving?" he asked, his voice quiet but serious. The question caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. The thought of leaving, of breaking all ties and starting a new life, seemed both terrifying and tempting. "Leave?" I repeated, feeling my heart clench. "You mean, leave Jonathan?" "Yes," he replied, his tone more of a statement than a question. I can't keep doing this, Maggie. I want to be with you, openly, without secrets and lies. But I know it's a huge step, and I don't want to pressure you. I was silent, thinking over his words. Nick wanted more than what we had now. He wanted a real relationship, to be with me not just in secret, but openly. But what did that mean for me? Was I ready to leave Jonathan for Nick? Could I live with the fact that I had destroyed my family to be with another man? These thoughts haunted me. Every time we met, they resurfaced, making me question again and again what I was willing to do for my feelings. Our relationship with Nick continued to evolve, becoming more passionate and profound. But along with it, my uncertainty grew. How long could we keep our feelings hidden? How long could I balance between two worlds without destroying them both? The answers to these questions seemed increasingly unclear, and I knew that one day I would have to make a choice that would determine not only my fate, but the fate of those I love. Every morning, I woke up with a heavy heart. In recent weeks, my inner turmoil had reached its peak. I stood before the mirror, staring at my reflection, and felt a battle raging inside me. Everything I had built over the years now seemed fragile and unreliable, like sand beneath my feet on the shore. Outwardly, everything remained the same. Jonathan was still the attentive husband, caring for me as always. But inside me, a chasm was tearing open. With each passing day, Nick became a more important part of my life. Our secret meetings had turned into something more than just passion. I felt his presence even when he was far away. In the moments when we were together, I forgot everything, my obligations, my past, the future. But when I was alone, reality struck me with renewed force. One evening, when Jonathan was away again, I sat on the terrace, watching the garden gradually sink into darkness. Thoughts swirled in my head that I couldn't dispel. I knew that my relationship with Nick could no longer remain a secret, but I also understood that if I continued down this path, it would destroy everything Jonathan and I had built over the years. At that moment, I heard Nick approach me. He sat down beside me, and I felt his warm touch on my hand. His presence always brought me calm, but today it only intensified my inner conflict. "What are you thinking about, Maggie?" he asked, looking into my eyes, his voice quiet, but I could hear the concern in it. "About us," I replied, not averting my gaze. "About how long we can keep this up. I don't know what to do, Nick." He remained silent for a long time, as if contemplating my words. Then he leaned in closer and quietly whispered, "You know I want to be with you, Maggie. I don't want to live in the shadows anymore. I want a real relationship, but I understand how difficult this is for you." I nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. I knew he was right. We couldn't hide forever, but letting go of what we had seemed impossible. "I love Jonathan, Nick," I confessed, and the words felt like a knife to my heart. "He's a good man. He's done so much for me, and I can't just betray him." "I understand." His voice was full of sympathy, but I could see the worry clouding his face. "But you can't deny what you feel for me." "I can't," I said quietly, feeling despair wash over me. "But that doesn't make it any easier." Nick squeezed my hand tighter, and I felt his fingers tremble. His words were full of determination, but I sensed he was struggling too. "We can't live a lie, Maggie." His voice became firmer. "I want more. I want us to be together, openly, without secrets. I'm willing to risk everything to be with you." His words resonated within me. Nick was willing to do anything for us, but I couldn't make such a decision so easily. Thousands of thoughts swirled in my mind, but none provided an answer to the question of what to do next. "Nick," I whispered, searching for the right words. "I'm afraid. Afraid that if I choose you, I'll lose everything. But if I choose Jonathan, I'll lose you. I don't know how to deal with this." He took my shoulders and turned me towards him, forcing me to look into his eyes. In his gaze, I saw not only passion, but a deep affection that made my heart ache. "I'm not asking you to make a choice right now," he said, his voice softening. "But I want you to know that I'm here, beside you, and I'm not going to leave you." I nodded, but inside me, a storm still raged. I knew that my relationship with Nick was treading on thin ice, and any wrong move could destroy everything. My feelings for him were growing stronger, but so was my anxiety. The following days were filled with this contradiction. My attachment to Nick grew, but the guilt towards Jonathan became unbearable. I could no longer hide my feelings, but I couldn't bring myself to end things either. Every time Nick and I met, I felt the struggle inside me intensify. One day, when Nick and I met in the garden again, he unexpectedly spoke about the future. "Maggie, I don't want to rush you," he began, his voice full of seriousness. "But I want you to know that I'm willing to wait. I'm ready to wait as long as it takes, but I want you to be with me. I want a real future for us." Those words made me think. I realized that our relationship couldn't continue in this way forever. But what did that mean for me? Could I make a choice that would determine my entire future? That evening, when I returned to the room I shared with Jonathan, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. The internal conflict was tearing me apart. I loved Jonathan, but my feelings for Nick had become a revelation I could no longer ignore. I knew I had to make a choice that would shape the rest of my life. But was I ready for it? Could I live with the fact that I had destroyed my family for another man? These questions tormented me, giving me no peace, and I understood that I had no answers yet. The decision didn't come to me right away. It arrived gradually, like a fog descending on the earth in the early morning, enveloping everything around. I realized that I couldn't continue this relationship with Nick, that we had gone too far, and now we had to take a step back, no matter how painful it might be. My heart was breaking with pain, but my mind insisted that this was the only right path. For a long time, I couldn't find the strength to tell Nick about it. I knew he understood that our time was coming to an end, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Every time we met, I felt a sadness in his eyes, hidden behind a mask of calmness. He knew this moment was inevitable, and I knew he was preparing for it just as I was. One evening, I called Nick and asked him to come over. I knew this meeting would be our last. My heart was pounding with anxiety, but I kept myself composed, trying to remain calm. When he arrived, I was already sitting on the terrace where we so often met. The evening was quiet and cool, and I felt as though the world around us was holding its breath along with me. Nick sat beside me, and a silence hung between us, filled with the realization of what was to come. I couldn't speak right away because every word I was about to say seemed too painful, but I knew I had to do it. "Nick," I finally said, my voice barely audible, "we can't continue this any longer. It's destroying both of us, and I don't want to cause any more pain to you or Jonathan." He remained silent, looking at me with such deep sadness that it became difficult for me to breathe. I saw his fingers clench into fists, and I knew he was struggling with himself, trying not to say something that could change my decision. "I understand, Maggie," he finally said quietly, his voice full of bitterness. "But it's so hard for me to let you go. You've become everything to me that I didn't even know I needed." Those words made my heart falter again. I knew Nick was sincere in his feelings, and it hurt me to realize that I was causing him such pain. But I also knew that continuing this was wrong. I nodded, understanding that he was right. This was our last chance to be together, the last time we could surrender to our feelings without thinking about the consequences. I knew that after this night, we would never be the same people we were before, but right now, I didn't want to think about it. We spent that night together, and it was filled with passion, despair, and a love that had been hidden in our hearts all this time. We didn't talk about the future, didn't discuss what would come next. That night, there was only the present, and we surrendered to it completely. As morning slowly crept through the curtains, I lay next to Nick, feeling an emptiness grow inside me. I knew this was our last moment together, and that an inevitable separation lay ahead. I looked at his face, at how peacefully he slept, and felt my heart breaking apart. I carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake him. I needed to leave before I changed my mind, before I decided to stay. I put on my clothes, grabbed my keys, and left the room, trying not to look back. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew this was the only right path. When I stepped outside, the cool morning air enveloped me, making me shiver. I got into my car and looked at the house where I had left Nick. Tears began to roll down my cheeks again, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I knew that if I didn't leave now, I never would. I started the car and drove away, leaving behind that house, that last evening, that last meeting. Inside, I felt empty, but I understood that I had made the right choice. I knew that now I had to get my life back on track, no matter how difficult it might be. But the memory of Nick and that night, filled with passion and despair, would stay with me forever. The days following our last meeting with Nick passed in a strange, painful daze. I tried to return to a normal life, but every time I looked at Jonathan, something tightened inside me. I could no longer hide the truth. I could no longer play the role of a devoted wife, knowing that I had betrayed his trust in the most terrible way. Everything Jonathan and I had now seemed like a lie to me. I couldn't hug him, couldn't look him in the eyes without feeling a torturous sense of guilt. This guilt was eating me up inside, and I knew I couldn't continue living like this. The decision came to me suddenly, like a lightning bolt striking my heart. I had to tell him the truth, no matter how awful it was. We could no longer live with this secret between us. That evening, when I finally made the decision, Jonathan came home late, as usual, tired after work. I couldn't delay the moment any longer, even though my heart was pounding as if it were about to leap out of my chest. We sat in the kitchen, eating dinner in silence, and I couldn't find the right words to start the conversation. But the longer I remained silent, the stronger the feeling became that if I didn't do it now, I never would. Finally, I took a deep breath and looked him in the eyes. He raised his gaze from the plate, noticing my tension. "Jonathan, we need to talk," I began, feeling my voice tremble with anxiety. He frowned, sensing something was wrong. I saw how his face gradually changed as he realized the seriousness of the situation. "What happened, Maggie?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I couldn't hide the truth any longer. All the words I had tried so hard to suppress now came rushing out, and I couldn't stop them. "I made a terrible mistake," I began, and tears started to well up in my eyes. I I betrayed you, Jonathan. I had an affair with Nick." Those words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and I saw Jonathan's face turn pale. His eyes widened in shock, and he froze, as if not believing his ears. "What did you say?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was such disbelief in it that it scared me. "I can't hide this anymore," I continued, feeling the tears streaming down my cheeks. "I made a mistake, and I understand that I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't live with this lie any longer." His face changed before my eyes. Shock gave way to anger, and I saw his hands clench into fists. "You slept with my brother?" he growled, his voice becoming rough and threatening. "How could you, Maggie? How could you do this to me?" I saw the fury ignite in his eyes, and it made me feel unbearable pain. I knew I had destroyed everything we had built together, and the realization was agonizing. "Jonathan, I understand this is unforgivable." I tried to justify myself, but he interrupted me. "Understand?" His voice grew sharper. "Do you understand that you've destroyed our life, destroyed everything we had? How could you do this?" And with Nick, with my brother. He stood up from the table, pushing the chair back so hard that it fell to the floor with a crash. I saw his shoulders trembling with anger, saw him trying to control himself, but the fury was consuming him more and more. I don't want to see you in this house anymore. His voice was filled with resolve, and it sounded like a sentence. Get out. I don't want to hear your excuses anymore. You betrayed me, Maggie, and I can't forgive you. I knew I deserved every word, every emotion of his. I silently stood up, feeling my legs weaken beneath me, and headed for the door. Tears blurred my vision, but I knew I had no right to stay here any longer. I had destroyed everything that was important to me, and now I had to live with that realization. I left the house that had been our world, leaving behind all the dreams, plans, and memories. It was already dark outside, and the cool wind chilled my face, mixing with the hot tears I couldn't hold back. I felt broken, empty, but I knew this was the consequence of my choices. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I would ever be able to rebuild my life after what I had done, but I knew one thing. I had to tell the truth, no matter how bitter it was. And now, I had to live with the consequences of that truth, alone, without Jonathan, without Nick, with only one feeling: guilt, which would stay with me forever. The days after Jonathan filed for divorce stretched into an eternity. Time lost its meaning, becoming a viscous mass in which I sank deeper and deeper. The world around me seemed to freeze, leaving me alone with my thoughts and feelings. I felt as though I had fallen into an abyss with no way out. Every morning, I woke up with a sense of emptiness inside me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to force myself to get up. My entire world had collapsed, and I didn't know how to go on living. My mistake, that fateful affair with Nick, had taken away everything that mattered to me. And now, all I had left was to suffer from the realization that I had destroyed my own life. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that was eating me up inside. It was like a poison, slowly seeping into every cell of my body. Every minute, every second, I replayed the events of the past few months in my mind, trying to understand how I had let it go so far, how I could have so cruelly betrayed Jonathan. I remembered his eyes, full of pain and disappointment, when he heard the truth from me. That expression never left me. It haunted me in my sleep and while I was awake. I felt my soul tearing apart from the realization that I had caused him such pain. And with that realization came another, understanding that I could never regain his trust, that our love had died because of my mistake. Every time I stepped outside, the world seemed foreign, empty, and meaningless. I saw people walking by, talking, laughing, but to me, it all seemed distant, unreal. My heart was closed off to everything that once brought me joy. I could no longer enjoy simple things like a walk in the park or reading a book. Inside me, there was only pain, which never let go, not for a single moment. Dreams became my only escape from reality, but even there, Jonathan's shadow followed me. I saw him again and again, in various scenes from our past, but every time it ended with him leaving me alone. I would wake up in a cold sweat, realizing that even in my dreams, I couldn't find peace. My friends and loved ones tried to support me, but I couldn't accept their help. Every attempt to comfort me only intensified my sense of isolation. I felt that I deserved all this pain, deserved the suffering that had befallen me. I had brought myself to this state, and now I had to pay for my mistakes. Pain became my constant companion. It didn't leave, day or night. I tried to find a way to dull it, throwing myself into work, keeping busy, but it brought no relief. My mind was filled with only one thing: regret. Regret for losing the person who loved me, for destroying my life and my family. Sometimes I thought about what I could have done differently. If only I had stopped earlier, if I had resisted that insane attraction to Nick, maybe everything would have been different. But now, these thoughts only added fuel to the fire. I understood that it was useless to dwell on the past, but I couldn't stop regretting every step I had taken. It had been several months since Jonathan filed for divorce, but time hadn't healed my wounds. I still felt lost, as if wandering through a desert without any purpose. Pain and guilt had become my constant companions, and I didn't know how to rid myself of these feelings. I feared that I would never find happiness again, that this dark period of my life would stay with me forever. Every night I went to bed thinking that maybe tomorrow would be easier. But the morning brought the same pain, the same heaviness on my soul. I didn't know how to go on living. I didn't know if I would ever find peace again. The only thing left for me was to continue living with this pain, knowing that I had destroyed my own life and now had to bear this burden. If I could go back and fix everything, I would do it without hesitation. But life doesn't give second chances. My story is one of mistakes that destroyed everything that was dear to me. I lost love, trust, and respect. And now all I can do is live with the consequences of my choices. If you ever find yourself at a crossroads, facing a choice between loyalty and betrayal, stop and think about where your actions might lead. Passion and a fleeting infatuation may seem thrilling, but they are not worth the pain and destruction that can follow. I know this because I've been through this hell myself. Don't destroy your life over a moment of weakness. Cherish what you have and value those who are close to you. Let my story be a warning because sometimes mistakes cannot be undone, and they can cost you everything you love.